Good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Jagatram, yours is the keynote. You're not here, but you're here. Oh, I'm so sorry, sir. I thought that's why you're here, because it says your keynote. Yes, sir. But this is yours. They didn't tell you. I'm sorry about that. I don't know. I'll ask Dr. Partho. Thank you. The convener for the session is actually Dr. Satyajit Sinha. I am not Dr. Satyajit Sinha. Education can be a bonding experience, as you can see from the photos.
I'm sorry we are blocking.
No, not at all. You're occupying the center stage. So, happy to call all the chairpersons, Dr. Priyanka, Dr. P.K. Verma, Dr. Gayatri, Dr. Devendra Maheshwari, Dr. Vinita Gupta, Dr. Sohail, and Dr. Vanati. And to get this session, which is research training, research during residency, to get this off to a good start, the first one is topic is thesis publication, must versus optional. A must, Dr. Vinita Gupta, and just optional is Dr. Gayatri. Are either of them here? Oh, you're here. I'm sorry.
Good afternoon, everybody. Topic which has been allotted to me to talk about the residence thesis is thesis publication a must. So why is thesis being given to the students? Like, it's basically been made as a mandate or as an essential part of the post-graduation medical teaching, not only in India but also abroad. What is the purpose of this? The purpose is basically we want to have the spirit of a curiosity, a questioning in the student, and expose the candidate to the various techniques of research. And the long-term goal is basically he should have an analytical attitude, a problem-solving behavior, and ability to critically interpret any scientific literature which is given to him. But how do we do that? The next logical step, once you have written your thesis, is you should be able to disseminate your results. If you don't do that, then your results your thesis is lying in a corner. Nobody knows about it. Nobody comes to is even aware of it except for your own institute. So traditionally, how can you disseminate your results? This can be done either by presenting in a scientific conference, in a meeting, or by publication in a peer-indexed journal. So presentations rapidly provide to the audience, like we have audience conference attendees, you'll be able to rapidly disseminate the data there. But publication is much more wider, is much more easily available, visible, and can be seen across the world. So that's the best advantage of publication over a presentation in a meeting, which is very limited scope. So scientific papers, as the scientists have said, are the best method of communication of your results. Science, as we know, the research is the language of science. So papers are a long-lasting contribution. You can read them many times over the following years. Anytime you want to go back, you can see the paper. Anytime who's doing a related research can go back and refer to your paper. If you just leave it at your thesis level, it will be just lying, as I told, in one corner, either in your shelf or in your library shelf, or maybe just in your hard drive. But if you decide to publish, then many other researchers who are doing a similar research would be interested, who want to know about the previous literature would be interested. So please, don't let your thesis be lying in a dusty corner. Keep it alive. Next is scientific research also provides a link between the production of knowledge and its use. Especially in our profession, it gives us newer treatment modalities, newer preventions which are coming up in the scenarios. If you leave your research as inadequate and incomplete, if you do not publish it, it remains at that level. So it will weaken the medical literature which we have developed over the years. Second thing, it also enhances your own career. For a resident, once you have published your thesis, it gives you credibility, not only academic credibility, but also a professional credibility. It helps you stand out if you're going for a job amongst all the other candidates. It shows your future employer that you're very, very hardworking, you're determined, and you're dedicated to your profession. For students, and especially if you want to pursue further studies, it will help in your fellowships. For a practicing doctor, you will be able to analyze your journal articles, you'll be able to update your knowledge and put it into your practice, And if you want to become a teacher in an institute, obviously it will help you carry out further research work, getting promotions, and all those things. Besides this, if publication is done in a peer-reviewed index journal, it adds to the quality. So it is the best judge of the quality of your research. So if you know you have done a good thesis, if publications are not coming from an institute, you can very well say that probably it's some fudgy research is going on there, or it's some basic quality research is not happening there. So peer-reviewed publications tell the scientific community that there is an integration of good teaching and good research happening in medical colleges. So you should choose topics which are publishable. In addition, you do not want whatever manpower, whatever money, time, and other resources which you have put into your thesis, they should not go waste. So please publish it. And the feeling of elatement, or the feeling, that high feeling which you get when you have, oh, I have a paper on my name, that is a very huge accomplishment at resident level. It boosts your confidence to a total whole new level. So, and for others, even for later styles, your recognition. So it is said, publish or perish. Even if when you go up there, your name has to be there somewhere. So otherwise your name would not be there. So please, always publish. Read your thesis. People will be reading your will not be reading your thesis. They'll be reading your publications. So for this reason, for all the various enumerations, advantages I have enlisted, I would say the thesis publication is a must. But still, in today's scenario, around the world, many theses remain unpublished. So the journey of a thesis should not stop from a womb. It should go its tomb, which is basically the publication of the research in an index journal. I know it is not easy. It will take a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, but nothing comes easy in life. Even Santa comes with a clause. Thank you. So thesis publication definitely is a must.
I like that even Santa comes with a clause. I think that's nice. So thank you, Dr. Vinita. Is the counterpoint person here? No. So let me ask you to play the counterpoint yourself, and Dr. Vanati and Dr. Sohail. My only concern when I see residents, when there is a deadline for thesis submission, frantically filling that Excel sheet and God knows doing what else, whether can you really trust that thesis and put it out there for publication? What is your, what are the, how can you prevent some nonsense being put out there?
I think that was an excellent talk.
It
by
was, it
Vinita,
was.
And it's an excellent point which you're raising as well. And I think all of us will agree when we are managing residents that thesis is looked upon as a burden by many. So that's point number one, and perhaps that attitude needs to change, that you don't look upon thesis as a burden, but thesis is an essential part of, it's an essential exercise which is part of your medical degree to learn to adopt a scientific approach or a research approach to a particular work which is being done. So that's how you have to approach it. And perhaps if you learn to inculcate that approach, is when what the problem which you're saying can be addressed. The voice in your head must be yours. It must not be your chief guides or your co-guides. I always tell this to my residents. The voice in your head must be yours, that you should have that drive to do it and take it beyond what it is. That said, I also think it is a huge responsibility of the guide to really give innovative ideas, to really work upon those things which are lying unexplored. And I totally agree, it's not a very easy point in today's world, and also given the limitations and restrictions within which several teaching institutions and teachers are working. So it becomes very difficult for every thesis to reach a level of a publication. But I think the job entirely lies with the mentor to take her mentee to a level at which that they don't look upon it as a burden, but as an enjoyable exercise, which probably would help to further them in their path, in their career path.
Excellent points. What do you think? The onus of publishing, should it lie with the student? Because they're busy with clearing exams and going on with fellowship, or do you think it should be mandatory that it's given to the guide and the guide pursues the publication?
I think it should be a combined effort. The mentor is always well versed in an approach towards how to bring about a publication. Bringing about a publication is just not about writing it well. First, the content needs to be strong. The concepts need to be strong, and the methodology adopted to achieve those concepts and those lacunae in knowledge which you have probably cited out in your research need to be strong. And that's when you can take your publication into a higher index journal. It's not easy getting your, even in very good researchers do not always find a place in index journals, because now we are becoming more and more tubular in our practices. And as we become more and more tubular, it becomes very difficult to publish our results in journals with good impact factors, because it becomes closed group reading, and closed group reading journals do not have high impact factors. That's something which ophthalmology is always facing vis-a-vis when you look at medicine, or even when you're vis-a-vis looking against cataract based journals here. So that's always a particular point, but the onus lies on the guide, and the student should not take a free ride, should also cooperate. It's not about conducting the thesis ethically with good morality. As you say, it's not just X, Y, and Z which is filled on into their performers. They should have that ethical responsibility to take it forward, but by and large, it will be a combined exercise.
Okay, good points. Let's move on to the next topic, which is formal teaching of research methodology. Is it must or is it optional? So Dr. Surajit Sen is going to speaking on must, and Dr. Richa Gupta on just optional.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll discuss about the formal teaching of research methodology and why I think it is a must. So what is research? The research is a quest for knowledge through diligent search or investigation or experimentation aimed at the discovery and interpretation of new knowledges. What is a scientific method? The scientific method is a systematic body of procedures and techniques applied in carrying out investigation or experimentation targeted at obtaining new knowledge. So here the research and scientific methods may be considered a course of critical inquiry leading to discovery of facts or information which increases our understanding of human health and diseases. So what is essentially research methodology? It consists of the planning of a research, conducting the result, and publishing the result. So why it is important to know about this all methodology? I'm just going to discuss about few very basic terminologies which is used in the research, and I'll just explain why it is important to know all about this. First, coming to the study design. So a study can be an observational study or can be an interventional study. Observation study can be a descriptive study or analytical study. The examples of descriptive studies are case report, case research, descriptive cross-sectional studies. Analytical studies can be analytical comparative cross-sectional study, case control study, or cohort study. The examples of interventional studies can be a clinical trial or community trials. So a student must know what they are dealing with. Now, just knowing all this terminology doesn't help. You have to understand that this pyramid also. As you move up this pyramid, the stronger methodology is there, less bias is there, and controls for comparison will be there, and there will be fewer studies. So it is a good idea to draw a conclusion from the RCTs, not from the case report or the case series. A study location, it should be noted whether it is a single center or multi-center, whether the baseline criteria are similar in all the centers or not. Time perspective or data collection, it can be a retrospective, prospective, or cross-sectional study. Retrospective, though the strength will be a little bit less, but it is not through and through useless study. It can be a basis of a prospective, future prospective study also. The sample size, it depends on the study question or design, preferably be representative of the population in a given scenario, and depends on prevalence of the clinical condition. So whether it is a rare disease, the sample size will be less, or if it is a more prevalent disease, the sample size is supposed to be more. The backbone of the study is always the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Whenever a student is seeing any article or planning any study, definitely the inclusion and exclusion criteria should be the must. And it is the inclusion criteria is attributes of the subject that are essential for their selection to participate, and the inclusion criteria function remove the influence of specific confounding variables. The exclusion criteria include factors or characteristics that make the recruited population ineligible for the study. Now coming to the protocol part, if someone is planning to do some study, they should know about the protocol. So what is the protocol? The study protocol incorporates all the information regarding the study in a concise manner. The protocol should contain background information of the study, objectives, ethical aspects, study design, methods of assessment, statistics and evaluation, administrative issues, and the references. Ethical consideration, the World Medical Association has developed the Declaration of Helsinki as a statement of ethical principles to provide guidance to physicians and other participants in medical research involving human subjects. It has total 32 points. The main 4 principles are: subjects are made fully aware of the nature and purpose of the research project, consent is voluntarily given, the person involved has the legal capacity to give consent, the responsibility to obtaining consent rests with the researcher, so privacy and confidentiality should be maintained. So why it is a must now? To learn the proper way to express their thoughts, to learn the proper way to document their thoughts, to be able to understand the available scientific resources and draw a conclusion from them, and to learn the proper way to enrich the science, fraternity, and hence the society. Thank you.
So very good afternoon to the chairpersons. Lovely to have Dr. M.S. ma'am on the stage. So I'm going to talk against the motion. I congratulate Dr. Shurojit on his talk. Being the Director of Education and Research at my center, I truly believe in the pop culture, which is publish or perish. But my dear opponent, when is the right time to start with it? When do you actually introduce this concept to the residents? So do you really believe that a child who's learning alphabets can write a book? So the first and foremost thing whenever you're playing a new game is to know the game first, right? And a resident who's just entered is yet to give a direction to his or her thought process. What happens if you do not have a thought process? Okay, I had a very nice animation here. You either just follow blindly the people around you, or you just go aimlessly around. Without a basic background, one can neither perform a fruitful research or analyze the available literature. And it's like an empty mind is, empty vessel makes more noise. So again, without a basic knowledge, this resident is caught up in ego caressing the seniors. So this point has already been discussed during the last debate. Precious time and effort is put in studies which has questionable relevance. Like this actually was an article published in BJO in 2002, done by an ophthalmologist. So do woodpeckers with their, woodpecking get headaches? Do they have RDs? So what is the rectal pressure necessary to expel fecal matter by a penguin? And when you attach a stick to a chicken, does it walk like a dinosaur? So these have actually been studied. And so if direction to thoughts and steadiness of hands are not important, then why not let the first years operate? So actually I did a small exercise in my center. These are all consultants who have done their fellowship from premier institutes. I went around asking them how many surgeries have they done in their residencies. And this was shocking. These are the numbers that they have done, during their 3 years of residency. And there is another epidemic amongst the doctors, residents, mostly, it's burnout. So burnout not only with stress of managing patients, of long working hours, they also have personal demons. So we have all done our residencies. How can we forget those sleepless nights? Those moments when a small mistake puts you in front of the HOD and you are just wishing you were dead. And that is why doctors have the highest rate of suicide amongst all professions. There are a lot of studies being done all over the world. These are few which were done in India. So you can see Delhi, Punjab, Chandigarh, Aligarh, and all of them have the same conclusion. So almost 90% of the residents have felt burnout. Almost 80% have had some amount of stress during their residency. And almost 20% of them have had suicidal thoughts. And how can we forget these news, these faces, these names? These are all residents who are no more now. And on one hand, we have helpline numbers and hashtags. Dr. Heal Thyself, to address the mental health issues that they have. And on the other hand, we are standing on this podium, having this debate, actually defending to add more burden to them. So the need of the hour is to strengthen our residency program towards a better clinical understanding and improving the surgical techniques. If we leave aside the mental health issues, poor clinical acumen and research are definitely two main deficient areas in today's program, but which one is a greater evil needs to be decided and worked upon first. Thank you so much.
Interesting things to think about. Seems like another whole other topic that we can talk about, residents and resident burnout. So stick around. We're going to have stuff about problem resident and etc. Other things later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
What are the chances that we'll have two glaucoma fellows from Shankar Netralaya, having their debate here, debating against each other? What are the chances? And thank you for not putting up Chennai there amongst the burnout. Yeah, or stress levels. So jokes apart, I wanted to ask, people from around the audience as well, do you formally teach research methodology? I know the National Board in the last many years has been trying to have a research methodology course, which is mandatory for the first year postgraduate to attend. We in SN do our own course as well, in addition. But what is the practice? Do you think it's important, or do you think it's just whoosh, it all goes, there's so much they're taking in at that time. They're trying to learn ophthalmology. They're trying to get their, surgical suturing going on. And then here they have these 2 days of intensive packed research methodology. That's, is that the right way? How do you do it?
Actually, I am from Maharashtra. So situation earlier was there was nothing like a research methodology workshop. But now we have made it compulsory at least to sensitize them. So it is in the first year only, they are made to compulsorily made to attend some kind of research kind of methodology.
Same in my institute, we have a research methodology workshop which is mandatory for all the residents once they enter. Because anyway, in my talk, as I mentioned, thesis is mandatory for them. So thesis is also a research work. So till you know how to start with it, how will you proceed with it? So it's like even those 2 days of workshop, that intensive workshops, everything is not going to go to their heads. But at least it gives them a basic introduction to those things, so that at least with the help of their mentors and the people around who are dealing with research methodology, you have the statisticians with you, you have the research department with you, they can always go back to them and ask. But at least they should have the curiosity is started at that level when they initially attend that workshop. So that is one thing, and I would agree that it should be a must, because since thesis is a must, so then you should have the basics how to proceed with the research.
For us, we have a very structured research methodology teaching, which is directed to the first semesters. We have a semester system, so the first 6 months are the first semesters. And when they join, and that is the time when their thesis guides and topics are allotted here. So this is a norm for almost all specialities across AIIMS here. So we have the research methodology being taught by our biostatistics department as a 1-hour course for the new entrants of all postgraduate courses, which is spread about over a week to 10 days, and they are morning classes run between 8 to 9. And these first semesters across the various specialities are given a schedule such that the clinical work across the various departments and various units in every specialty is not hampered, and they are allowed to go and attend. So there is a scheduled roster, so we know that in my unit, this first semester is not going to be there in this particular week and is going to attend the research methodology. And this research methodology is not much like a crash course, but it caters to what they need to know in terms of starting a thesis. Understanding study designs, understanding how to go about sampling, and those related. I think you will all largely agree that most of us have studied some basics of this when we did our undergraduation. I think a large part of it was covered in our community medicine textbooks here, where they do have I think a very elaborate chapter. I remember that very well because I never used to like that chapter when I was an undergraduate. But as we all graduated and went further, I realized that was one of the most important chapters, where we actually learn to analyze any particular article you are reading. The statistical relevance and the strength of the statistics is what is going to be the evidence supporting the particular research question which is being addressed. And that is what perhaps you're learning and you're teaching. I still feel I'm learning my statistics. I still feel you can take statistics to such an high level. Statistics is an own subject by itself. And we are probably doing a very small part when you're applying it to as biostatistics. I still learn, I still discuss with my statistician. I still ask him, is my study design right is the right way of approaching the research question in this particular area which I have chosen. So I think it's a continuous learning, and you need to teach it in a way that the student can absorb and take it in, rather than trying to teach them everything. It will just be a textbook learning then.
Good points, and I just my little 2 cents worth. When we started a formal research methodology course at Shankaritralaya, we encouraged the guides also to attend. Because sometimes they are first-time guides, and they've been busy in the first 5 or 6 years of their consultancy, developing their surgical skills, or making sure they don't miss anything in clinical practice, maybe getting married, having children, all other kind of things. So it's good for them and for the student to have a little refresher for them as well. So we encouraged all the new guides to attend as well. Okay, so we move on to the next topic, which again interesting, the same thread, which is publication in peer-reviewed journal. I'm presuming during the residency period is what this is. Must versus optional. Do we have the speakers here, Dr. Soumya and Dr. Parvez? Yes, so Dr. Soumya Venkatesh is going to speaking on it's a must. Please.
Very good afternoon, everyone. I thank AIOS ARZ for having given me the opportunity to be a part of this wonderful Apex conclave. And I'm here to reiterate a few points on that a publication is a must. After Krishna finished preaching Gita to Arjuna, Arjuna had a doubt. What did Krishna say? I think it's difficult to remember really all the verses. Then definitely, good that Bhagavad Gita was published. Definitely, otherwise Gita would have been lost to mankind. Right, all of us do think, why should I publish? Yes, I have patience and practice, I won't perish, but I'll only flourish, whether I publish or not. That would be the common attitude amongst all the clinicians. But yes, knowledge is definitely the property of entire mankind, and if you do not write it, it is lost without the written records. And it cannot be widely circulated without effective duplication of the knowledge. And therefore, the medical knowledge or the communication among physicians is definitely by means of the greatest part of the communication takes place within the network of medical journals. Yes, do we have some findings which are credible ones, enough to disseminate publicly? Then why not we make sure that they enter the permanent searchable public record? So definitely they are the currency of the world of science. Now, as a clinician, yes, if you publish a case report, you know that such things, you can tell the world that such things do exist and it can be handled this way or should not be handled this way. Now, if you publish a case series, definitely you are describing the typical and the atypical manifestations or spectrum of manifestations of the disease, and also similar or dissimilar findings can lead to some new discoveries as well. Now, original research, one of the highest, as considered as the highest in the order of publication. So you make the scientific or the medical world know that what research you have done, and also if it's a novel one, definitely you are the authority in that. And reviews, yes, definitely the synopsis about the area of your expertise can be dealt with. Yes, don't perish but flourish by publishing. Now, as a clinician, yes, if you publish, definitely you have a professional visibility, and the Googling patients definitely tell you that I found your name elsewhere when I was searching the data, and yes, this acts as a bonus for you. So evidence-based medicine definitely comes only with publication. Now, as an academician, it's a marker of academic success. Then by writing the aims and objectives, definitely you have the name and fame, and you're also responsible for getting some grants for the institution as well. And then yes, a role model for the postgraduates to publish and do research. So definitely the impact of a high publication in a high impact journal or the scope of a Scopus index journal is definitely beyond the material gains. Now, definitely getting cited by others definitely improves our performance, as well as you get recognized by the institution, and as well as the people who matter the most. And definitely some of them do even know you by the initials because they would have cited your article. And then as for a staff or a faculty, definitely if you publish and get promotions, for the promotions, definitely publications do become mandatory. So publish and flourish should be the mantra these days. And as a researcher, yes, if you have done a research, if you have found out some novel topic, it's definitely it better not to hide them and publish it and publish it. It's like if you do not publish it, you have manufacturing a product and not launching it. Now it forms a permanent database and a permanent searchable record. Now on the personal front, yes, you have a practice of writing manuscripts. The whole process of writing a manuscript is definitely enjoyable and improves your writing skill too. It's like a kind of relaxation when you're caught amidst all of your academic activities. It's kind of relaxation. So those interests like writing, statistics, etc., which was on the back burner, definitely can be rekindled. And on the personal front, you have great gains with respect to knowledge and updating. And also, you know what's going on in the world. So epidemiology of diseases which are prevalent in other parts of the world also can be known. So definitely you have some kind of a comparative data with you. And then publish to gain, otherwise you will lose. So you're giving back to your institution by means of ranking systems, increasing your ranking systems, and also marker of accountability and measure of research productivity. Yes, so the importance of publications definitely cannot be overemphasized. So we have chosen a medical profession, and it is our duty to keep abreast with the newer concepts and newer knowledge that have been there, and then definitely that helps in having a good patient care. So the take-home message is there are so many advantages that why should I publish, and therefore I wish all of you a happy publishing time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Soumya. I think I'm going to tell my resident, write that manuscript. It's going to be relaxing. Yeah. All right. Dr. Pervez is now going to be speaking on that publication peer-reviewed journal is just optional. Thank you, Dr. Soumya.
We have heard the advantages of publication. What I presume the topic was whether you require the publication to be done in a peer-reviewed journal or not, or rather it is an optional or a must. I will be speaking on that. This is the slide which we have all seen many a times. People passing through the peer reviewing editorial board, which have got their own whims and fancy regarding the publication. A word or two about different types of peer review. You have got a single blind peer review and a double blind peer review, which you are all aware of it. This is the and how does it work? Basically, how does this peer review works? You submit your articles to a group of editorial board, which by their own standard assesses your work. The question is whether they like your work or not is a different matter. But whether it fits into their framework of publication, that is more important as we are concerned. And this is how the man who is sitting with his publication and waiting for the peer review to be forwarded to him so that his article can be published. He is kept in dark what is happening behind him. And there are also considerable differences in the level of people who are reviewing your article. In some journal, it might be the editorial board may be of very high quality. In the other, it may not be meeting the expectation of the medical field. So that is one of the lacunae of this peer reviewed, the whole story of the peer review. It's also used by conference organizer. Most of us has also evaluated various types of instruction courses and papers during our curriculum. And what is the main thing is that if the group of editorial board has a belief in your review or has a belief in your work, then only they will go ahead. Every journal has something, we are not biased, this and that. The main criticism of the peer reviewer was the method which I have already discussed. The critics of double blind argue that reviewers can guess who the authors are by looking at the references they cite. That is one of the objections of the double blind study. It has also come for a major criticism where the reviewer, the editorial board has failed to spot out the various fallacy of your presentation, the various errors in the presentation. They just went ahead. There was so much of pressure, burden on the editorial board that they said, okay, you can go for a publication. Another objection is that the peer review is not transparent enough. The reviews are inevitably subjective to different types of thoughts and whims and fancies of the reviewer board also. But also because reviewers may not appreciate, sometimes they have got a very dogmatic stand. They will not accept whatever new idea you promoted to them. They will stick to their idea, and your paper and publication get rejected. Another key criticism is that the process may stretch over a long period of time. You get bored out, you feel, okay, I had given it for publication, years have gone by, no result have been there. So that is also, this time period also is one of the constraints for the peer review. It may cause lengthy delay. It's a time consuming process, and it has been an extensive debate on the standard of the publication also. Sometimes it becomes very difficult for the magazine to protect the anonymity of the referees. They are sometimes, the magazine editorial boards are accused of protecting established opinions, and sometimes they may not be preventing the poor work to be published. Sometimes they accept the poor work also to a certain extent. So this is how it goes as far as peer review publication is concerned.
Okay, good counterpoint, and very good cartoons, actually. Any comments about the peer review? Dr. Vanti, you're very published, so any comments?
When you say is it must to publish in a peer-reviewed journal? I think not everything published in a peer-reviewed journal is worth reading. Not everything can be taken at face value. There are some things which you'll have to take with a pinch of salt here. So, so that is, that's something which he is what he intended to say in his rebuttal. But again, the quality of your work probably mandates whether it's going to go into a higher end journal. And it's not about only the work, it's about the way you present it. So the gift wrapper around it is also going to increase the face value of it. So the writing skills also add a lot of value to the kind of research. You might have done a good research, but if you're not a good writer, if you're not able to present it in the way which is acceptable to a particular journal. And again, by and large, you should also know which journal is going to be more receptive to the kind of research you're presenting it with. So these are all perhaps going to be the baseline facts when you are looking at publishing. And when you're looking at, especially for recruitments or moving up in career paths along teaching professions and in institution professions, which is again in India and largely in the West as well, your curriculum vitae is hugely based on the kind of publications. You have to look at your citation factors which you get. You have to look at your ResearchGate scores, and there are several others as such scores which are going to determine the importance of your publication. It need not necessarily be in the best journal, but it means how many times it has been quoted in reference to a work related to the particular field you have published in. So these are all probably going to sort of really evolve whether your publication is good or not. But at the end of the day, a well done work is really well done when you're able to put it up in the public front and you have people debate about it and talk about it critically in a good way. That perhaps is when I feel you've achieved the end result of what you embarked upon. So by and large, it's still, I think, boils down to the same question. Was your research question of such good value that it mandates a publication in a peer-reviewed journal? But don't lose heart if you're not able to publish. It doesn't really mean that it's not a bad work. There are so many other factors which he rightly pointed out. Today, it's not a fair trial for everybody. Today, we know that most journals are perhaps not really as unbiased as they ought to be here. So I think that's the bottom line. There needs to be a mix in both.
Okay, Good points. Just again, thank you to both the speakers. Just again, my 2 cents worth. I know in the very early years of my career, when I had not really published that much, I was asked to be a reviewer. And frankly, I was nervous because I really didn't know much about reviewing. But it was also a bit of an ego issue, to say, look, I don't know how to review. So I did review to the best of my ability. And then a couple of such reviews later, when one of my work went in for review, the reviewer's comments were longer than my paper. Only then I realized that reviewing is not an easy process and should not be taken lightly.
Agreed.
More importantly, I think it's worthwhile if the journal's editorial board, the editor, actually spends some time looking at the reviewers and choosing the reviewers carefully. Maybe even give reviewer training. It does not have to be again a workshop where you call everybody, leave their work and come and sit there for a day. It could even be done online with all the technology. You say, do you want to sign up for a reviewer course? So I'm just throwing these ideas out to anybody who's there. So I think it'll be good to develop and create a good cadre of reviewers.
Absolutely. You have to learn to be a good reviewer. It gets acquired over a period of time.
Absolutely.
I think I'm a better reviewer now than I used to be, say, 15 years ago. And I still feel perhaps I'm not as good as a reviewer as several others in my field. Again, age is not a factor, but it's perhaps the aptitude of a person to think out of the box and able to pick up those fine points and intricacies when you're reviewing a particular paper.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we move on to the next topic, which is how should a thesis topic be? Should it be routine or should it be novel? To speak on routine is Dr. Rudra Prasad Ghosh, and novel is Dr. Hema Malini. Is Dr. Hema Malini here? The podium is all yours.
Good afternoon, seniors, juniors, and colleagues. Today I am going to speak in favor of routine thesis topic. So to start with, what is a thesis? A dissertation or thesis is a document submitted in support of a candidature for an academic degree or professional qualification presenting the author's research and findings. In some countries or universities, the thesis or cognate is used as a part of a bachelor's or master's course, while dissertation is normally applied to a doctorate, while in others the reverse is true. The dictionary's meaning of thesis is a proposition that is maintained by argument, a dissertation advancing an original point of view as a result of research, especially as a requirement for an academic degree. Or it can be a hypothetical proposition, especially one put forth without proof. According to philosophical thoughts, it can be a first stage of a Hegelian dialectic process. Choosing your thesis or dissertation topic, is it a hurdle to begin? Picking a topic for your dissertation or thesis may be the biggest hurdle you face in your post-graduation. Sure, you have to write the thesis or dissertation, but if you choose the wrong topic, you may not even get that far. Now, what should be the criteria for selecting a topic? Is this topic appropriate to the condition of your workplace? Will this topic appeal to my interest? Is this topic something I can speak about with enthusiasm and insight? Will I be able to offer a fresh perspective at this topic? When narrowing your topic, ask the following questions. What does the other professionals most likely know about this topic? What elements are most important to this topic? And how much can I competently research and report on in time if I am given to present it? Now, these are two very famous persons. One is Thomas Alva Edison, another is Albert Einstein. Both these two are very famous to us, one for his theoretical works and another for his application of theoretical works. So I'm entering to a conflict between theory and practice. Why I am coming to this topic, I will in later. When it comes to knowledge, there are different kinds of knowledge and different ways of acquiring each kind. On one side is theory and on the other side is practical application of theory. Both type of knowledge are important and both make you better at whatever you do. Theoretical knowledge teaches the why. It helps you understand why one technique works and another fails. It shows you the whole forest, build the context and helps you to set strategy. Where self-education is concerned, theory prepares you to set a direction for your future education. Theory teaches you through the experience of others, and practical knowledge helps you acquire the specific techniques that become the tools of your trade. It sits much closer to your actual day-to-day work. There are some things you can only learn through doing and experiencing. Where theory is often taught in the ideal of a vacuum, the practical is learned through the reality of life. Practical knowledge can often lead to deeper understanding of a concept through the act of doing and personal experience. Both of the above are important. You won't survive in any career unless you can bring result and to do what you need practical knowledge. There's no avoiding it. Now let us come directly to the topic. Ophthalmology thesis topic, what should they be? Thesis topic in ophthalmology should represent solid research in the sphere of the basis of strong evidence. While writing a thesis, one should pay attention to the statistical measures in the field to address the methods and techniques of solving difficult medical tasks. Thesis topics in ophthalmology are significant for the examination of the urgent topics on the eye disease and discovery of the means of treating the eye condition. So why for a routine thesis topic? It can totally be conducted in a hospital, mostly set up. You don't have to hop to other institutions of pure sciences, for example, so you save your money and your clinical training time. Involvement of resource persons is less, so savings of manpower. You decrease the budget of the project, and the routine research will be derived from your clinical, mainly from your clinical activity. You will find adequate literature and reference material in print as well as in the net. Your outcome may have direct application which will be helpful for the mankind. And the outcome of a routine thesis are most predictable as compared to a novel topic. A thesis topic which is novel is tough to undergo in a small institute with no or less collateral integration and parallel specialties. To conclude, thesis is just a stepping stone to learn research methodology, write a scientific article, conduct a research oneself. Interesting to the researcher should be prioritized. Scientific curiosity should be instilled. Let's begin it simply, learn simply. Only then we can take care of complicated matters. I'd like to take opportunity to invite you all for the next year conference at Kolkata 2021. Thank you.
Somebody called it the sweetest city
Yes.
this morning. I thought it's a city of sweets, but yeah, sweetest city, why not?
Actually, it was coined by the Chief Minister.
All right, lovely. And Dr. Hemalni, I think she has declared defeat. She didn't show up. Any comments about giving novel topics versus conventional, easy to do, general topics? Dr. Sohail, any comments?
One of the reasons why we choose, my opinion, is rather a routine topic is because there is a lot of material available for both the teacher as well as the student who is embarking the thesis. But nonetheless, if there is something novelty involved in the topic, then probably the guide may also be more keen to take part actively into that. That is my kind of approach to that. Like whatever new things I am trying, I try to recommend that to my students. So even I am a part of the research more actively.
Good point there.
I would also say the same, like if it's a novel thing, you have something new in your mind, it's always best to put that into implementation rather than going by the records and by the previous literature and doing the same repeat study in your institute of your population. Because as it's just, you're just adding an epidemiological or maybe just adding on to the literature of the same kind. So like as she told, your citation would be of the previous article, it will always be cited because that was the first article. So your citation index will not increase if you have just added another information of your region onto it.
Yes.
So a novel topic would always be better. It will always be looked upon at a greater height in the literature. That's my version on it.
So your part of rebuttal has been done by both of us.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the chairpersons. And quick announcement, the certificates of participation in today's teacher training. I know, I'm just doing an announcement before I forget. The teacher training programs participation certificates are available in Hall I, the neighboring hall. So please do collect it before you go. The next topic, we could all have very hot debates about this. Google allowed in OPD or not allowed? I know people are very passionate about this. Dr. Supriya Latka is going to be speaking. Are you speaking for? All right. Dr. Priyank Solanki is here? I think he's on Google.
Good afternoon, everyone. A sincere thanks to Team AIOS ARC for inviting me for this session all of us have a tendency to gather information before starting something new, be it either a business venture or a disease. Patients also do the same as soon as they are diagnosed with a disease. In pre-cellular era, people used to do it through gossiping, but now with all the technological advancements and with the availability of smartphones, this information is just a click away. So the question of the day is, should we promote this online health information seeking behavior of the patients? Now coming on to facts, there's a sea of information available on the internet, and this information can vary from physician reviews to patients' personal blogs. Many physicians feel that patients may not possess necessary skills to evaluate this medical information, and this misinterpretation can lead to misdiagnosis and treatment. Other physicians feel that some of the patients might ask unnecessary questions, thus consuming more consultation time, and they may even go to an extent for requesting for a change in treatment. Looking at the situation from patients' perspectives, patients obviously want to obtain information and clarify their doubts regarding their disease and treatment. And if this information available on internet does not match with the diagnosis given by their physician, then they start doubting their treatment, and all these questions arise like, am I actually suffering from the same disease, or should I go for another consultation? Now, isn't this the responsibility of all of us as a treating physician to clarify our patients' doubts? We can have two options. Either we feel threatened by this information and respond defensively by asserting their expert opinion. In doing so, this is the situation we might feel, and both there will be dissatisfaction, frustration, and anxiety, both on the part of the patient as well as on the physician. So do we want our patients to be unsatisfied and unhappy? Obviously not. Then going with the second option, we can collaborate with our patients in obtaining and analyzing this information and guide them to appropriate health information websites. The success of a treatment depends on the trust between the patient and the physician, trust from the patient side that he is in the right hands and getting the appropriate treatment, and trust from a physician side that his patient is compliant with his treatment. So patients should always be encouraged to initiate discussion. Correct online health information enables them to have a greater clarity and better understanding of their illness, and empowers them to play an active role in their disease management. Internet search behavior allows them to have a sense of control and thus enter into comprehensive negotiation with their physician. This is especially useful for managing chronic diseases like glaucoma, diabetes, and hypertension, where despite us telling them multiple times, patients still fail to adhere to requisite treatment and follow-up. So the need of the hour is to change from traditional physician-centric paternalistic model of care to relationship-centric participatory model, and for this, both patient and physician should always be on the same page. This is what we want at the end of our consultation. So now asking the question once again to the audience, should we promote this health information seeking behavior? I think the answer should be a big yes. Thank you, happy consultation.
Thank you, Dr. Supriya. What about Google by residents?
Because I think the talk was.
Yeah, that's okay. It's by, the focus was to find out if the residents are also allowed to use Google. But that's perfectly okay. It's important to know whether our patients, we feel comfortable with our patients doing the same. So what are your thoughts? What about, what do you think about residents being allowed to use Google?
Residents should always be allowed to use Google in a positive manner, because sometimes when we are busy, we just tell them that this person is having this particular disease, and then they are confused because we are busy, we do not explain them properly. So they go back and find out about that particular disease, they read about the symptoms, signs, so it should be allowed. But there should always be a limitation to that.
More thoughts from the chairpersons.
Rather than allowing them directly, we can suggest, why don't we check on the Google? If at all I tend to forget something, I'm like some concentration of drugs or something, like I'm doing a Horner test, and if I had to be more particular about 0.125% of pilocarpine being used, I'm in a state of doubts, then I can tell, why don't we check it? And as far as patients are concerned, it's potentially annoying, especially when you have a busy OPD and they are Googling every time and asking you a question one after the other. So that becomes a little kind of difficult situation, so annoying also.
Any thoughts?
I think all information given on Google is not really correct. So it always needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, and for a casual reader, it might look like it is the most authentic. And sadly enough, I do think a large amount of residents today are looking towards the net for supportive learning rather than authenticated textbook learning, which is perhaps much better, because they have so much distractions these days, so much less time, and they always find net learning is probably an easy learning, but probably that's not really an authenticated way of learning. It's nothing like, there's no shortcut for proper learning. That's what I always feel about it.
It's a pity Dr. Santosh was not here to give his talk on online resources in ophthalmology. It's a really very good talk. I've heard it year after year. Maybe we will coax him to give it next year. So please do attend next year as well. He has excellent resources of online learning in ophthalmology. I again, my 2 cents worth. I found Google or Google Images useful when I have to convey to a patient about disc pallor or some retinal lesion or something that is asymptomatic and I have picked it up and I am, say, investigating it further. I found it easy, instead of sending the patient for a photograph or spending time and money, I just pull up a similar looking lesion and use that as an example to explain their condition to them. I found that easy to do right then and there. Maybe something you can incorporate into your practice as well.
I think that's an aspect when you're looking at it when you're counseling your patient
Correct.
about their disease. When we look at it, when you're probably placing a question to a resident in clinical teaching, in your clinical rounds, I think we have come to the era of saying, please leave your phones outside.
That's right. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's nothing as annoying as somebody who's stealing a look into their phone from their pockets.
And answering from that.
And yes, answering from that. Yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Supriya. Is the counterpoint here? I think not. And so we conclude this session. Thank you so much, chairpersons. Pardon? No, this comes in the next. Yeah, next. Yeah. What does that say? Yeah, yeah. Ah. Oh. So is Dr. J.K. Reddy here? We're happy for anyone to speak. I tore the pages out of the program book. No, but we are excited to have you here. Please, Dr. Reddy. Not a problem.
Yeah, for a change, I'm not putting any slides here because nobody is looking at me, they are looking at the slides, so I decided not to put the slides. I go for a traditional way of teaching, which my professors taught me. The feedback comes as far as this program is concerned. We are talking about the feedback about the students and about the junior lecturers, junior teachers, or the senior consultants, and about even the professors in ophthalmology. The feedback is a two-way phenomenon. Where you give the feedback and you take the feedback. You take the feedback on you from the juniors and you give the feedback to the juniors also, to the other people also. So most of the times what we found in practice is feedback is more emotional. You are upset with a student, immediately you write and he's saying that he has done something wrong, and you are very happy with that, the emotion, you say, you compliment. Feedback is neither a compliment nor a criticism. Feedback is basically a method of conveying, or in a practice, how to improve or what you personally feel about that particular, how to improve his further professionally. So it should be a more constructive one, it should not be an emotional one. And the words we use in feedback should be, I feel it should be very important. The words like when you talk and call them, I could have done this like this, why you have done, the I and you should be removed when you are talking about that. So what can be done in that particular case, and you should be very specific. For example, a resident, my fellow does a first keratoplasty, I might have not liked it very, very much, then I could have been upset, then they're looking at that, then the staff will tell already that's okay, he's not happy. So the next time when they come, if we say, no, it's very bad, that's finished. So we should be very specific, whether suturing is bad or what is the same thing. When you clinically, when they diagnose what went wrong, we should be very specific when you are giving a feedback to our water matter. It's not because we are now talking about the teachers and the training modules. I had to specifically align myself to that particular talk. And at the same time, when you receive the feedback, so we also get a feedback about in our institute, we get a feedback from the past students about who is the best teacher in all our organization. Now we got around 6 hospitals with the DNB, around 20-30 students going on. We collected 200 students. In that, I don't mind saying that I stood somewhere around in the last 5 categories. Dr. Sudhakar there sitting is one of my colleagues. He always stands within 1 or 2 first top liked by the students. But that's true. That's true that I had to improve looking at Sudhakar what he is able to impress and his students. Then thinking that okay, my students are bad. They are not giving a bad feedback for me. So that's what generally happens. That's the feedback. Another thing, most important thing I think is this is more a hypothetical questions we ask them, in which imaginary. We imagine some questions and put them, and depending upon that feedback, we assess the candidates and performance, and we assess our own institution and everything. But I totally disagree with that. So how I take feedback is how I look at my students and people I train. After 5 years, how they are, how prosperous they are, how much money they made, how much, yes, money is a very important part of the prosperity in the world. A fool cannot become rich. It's impossible unless his father is also very rich, or a wife or a father-in-law. Somebody should be rich. He cannot become himself rich. So then first I will look at that, what he made. He bought a good car and he made a house, or where he is moving around. Then second thing, how many surgeries? I just ask them whenever when I meet them in the conferences, how many surgeries you are doing per year and what surgeries you are doing, how many outpatients you are seeing. So depending upon that, we had to change our training program. If you are training a person who is useless in the society, just moving around seeing 5 patients, it's a pity, it is shame for me. They should be fast, they should be prosperous, and they should feel proud that in their life and in the society. It's not just about, somebody asked me yesterday a question, a thesis work, what should be the thesis work? Thesis work should be innovative, and it should be really a hot topic, and the thesis is just a casual topic. I said if you put a hot topic for a thesis work, they're never going to learn clinical work. They have to work in a laboratory only. They cannot work in a practice. So it's so difficult to complete in 2.5 years or 2 years a real scientific work. It's almost impossible. A PhD work in ophthalmology at least takes 5 to 7 years to clear that. And so there are how many PhDs are there in ophthalmology in India? There are, except from Bangalore, Nara Netral, a few guys. The entire India, there are only few, 3 or 4 members, 5 members. And if you put a thesis work to the PhD level, he doesn't know anything clinically. He will be working for a few thousand rupees and moving in a bus or a car or a scooter. So that's why I don't take it. That's how I look at my feedback. I look at that's what I don't know. I want to know about the panelist's opinion. Thank you for this opportunity given to me.
Any thoughts on giving feedback? Do you use the traditional feedback sandwich? Which is much talked about?
I think you have to be a very brave teacher to be able to accept the feedback which your students would give out to you. Yeah, the feedback is going to be as grave as the stick which you sort of banish all the time. Yeah, but yes, getting a feedback is always something which is important and which helps you to become a better clinician, a better academician, and a better teacher. And as he rightly said, that perhaps not everybody can be a good teacher. The way of being a lovable teacher or getting your thoughts across to teach at the level a resident really needs to be taught is an art, and it needs to be mastered. It doesn't come naturally. It's a continuous learning on the job, perhaps. You learn to become a better teacher with every day. And a feedback always helps you to perhaps refine yourself in adopt an approach which will make you reach out to the needs of the particular person you're teaching.
Lovely. Thank you so much, chairpersons, Dr. Vinita, Dr. Vanity, Dr. Sohail.